The faint glow of streetlights stretched across the quiet roads of Marlo as Marcus Hayes gripped the steering wheel of his black sedan. The hum of the engine filled the silence, and the weight of another exhausting day pressed heavily on his shoulders. At 40, Marcus carried his years with quiet dignity. Short salt and pepper hair, a neatly trimmed beard, and eyes that had seen more than they let on. His tailored suit, now slightly wrinkled, spoke of authority, yet the tired slouch in his posture revealed the toll of long hours and relentless responsibility. Marlo was a small city, but tonight, its streets felt unusually hollow, the flicker of neon signs reflecting off puddles left by a brief summer rain. Marcus adjusted the rearview mirror and noticed flashing red and blue lights slicing through the darkness behind him. A sigh escaped his lips. Another traffic stop. Pulling over to the side, Marcus parked, rolled down his window, and waited. His heartbeat remained steady, but something about these situations always felt unpredictable. Moments later, Officer Logan Carter stepped into view, flashlight in hand, and tapped the beam against Marcus's windshield. Logan was in his mid-30s, with sharp blue eyes, a clean-shaven face, and an authoritative stride that spoke of both confidence and control. His uniform was pristine, badge gleaming under the flashlight beam, yet there was something in the way he carried himself. A tightness in his jaw, a quick flicker of condescension in his smile, that hinted at something more complex beneath the surface. "License and registration," Logan said curtly, his voice carrying a hint of sharpness that cut through the night air. Marcus reached calmly into his glove compartment, his movements slow and deliberate. "Is there a reason I was pulled over, officer?" Marcus asked, his voice steady, his eyes locking with Logan's. Logan smirked faintly, tilting his head to one side. "You seem awfully defensive for someone with nothing to hide. Didn't you see the stop sign back there?" Marcus raised an eyebrow. "I stopped at that sign, officer. Completely." Logan's smirk tightened into a thin line. "Well, I didn't see it that way." For a brief moment, the night seemed to pause. The sound of distant tires on wet pavement and the soft hum of the car engine filled the silence between them. Marcus could feel the air thickening, an invisible weight pressing down on both men. Logan leaned slightly closer to the window. "You know, people like you always think you can bend the rules and get away with it." Marcus inhaled slowly, the meaning behind those words settling into his chest like a stone. His grip on the steering wheel tightened momentarily before he forced himself to let go, releasing the tension into the night air. "Officer Carter," Marcus said evenly, his voice measured and firm. "I assure you, I'm not trying to bend any rules." Logan stepped back slightly, looking Marcus up and down before gesturing with his flashlight. "Step out of the car." There was no hesitation in Marcus's movement as he unbuckled his seatbelt and pushed open the car door. He stepped out, his polished shoes meeting the damp asphalt with a soft thud. Logan gestured toward the hood of the car. "Hands on the hood. Now." Marcus complied without a word, placing his palms flat against the cool metal surface. Logan patted him down roughly, his actions mechanical but edged with unnecessary force. Marcus closed his eyes briefly, letting out a silent breath, refusing to let frustration cloud his composure. Logan's voice cut through the silence again, sharp and cold. "What's a guy like you doing in a suit this nice? Driving a car like this at this hour? Doesn't quite add up, does it?" Marcus turned his head slightly, his calm gaze meeting Logan's sharp one. "Do you often ask every driver these questions during routine stops, officer?" Logan paused, his hand lingering on Marcus's shoulder before stepping back. There was something in Marcus's voice, an unshakable calm, an authority that didn't come from fear or submission, but from knowing exactly who he was. The two men stared at each other under the flickering light of a nearby street lamp, the tension between them almost tangible. Logan's jaw twitched, and for a brief moment, uncertainty flickered across his face. Marcus straightened his posture, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt. "Are we done here, Officer Carter?" But Logan didn't respond. Instead, his eyes narrowed slightly as if trying to piece together something just out of reach. Marcus took a step forward, his voice calm but firm. "You've done your inspection? You've asked your questions? But before we go any further, officer, there's something you should know." Logan's brow furrowed slightly, his flashlight beam flickering unsteadily for a moment. Marcus took a steady breath, his words landing like stones in a still pond. "I'm Marcus Hayes, head of internal affairs for the Marlo Police Department." The color drained from Logan's face as the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The rigid authority in his posture faltered, and for the first time that night, his eyes reflected something other than confidence. They reflected fear. Silence stretched between them, heavy and unyielding. Marcus held Logan's gaze, his expression unreadable, his presence commanding. "This conversation isn't over," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of unspoken consequences. He turned, walked back to his car, and slid into the driver's seat. The door closed with a solid thud, and Marcus started the engine. As he drove away, the faint outline of Logan Carter remained visible in his rearview mirror. A silhouette of a man forced to confront the consequences of his own choices. The city of Marlo stretched out ahead, but the echoes of that encounter lingered in the space between them. A reminder of how deeply broken systems could be, and how courage sometimes begins with a quiet refusal to look away. The night air in Marlo felt heavier as Marcus Hayes drove away from the encounter with Officer Logan Carter. His hands rested firmly on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched as he replayed the interaction in his mind. Years of experience in law enforcement had sharpened his instincts, and tonight, those instincts whispered something troubling. Logan Carter wasn't an anomaly. He was a symptom of something deeper, something rotting at the roots. As Marcus pulled into his driveway, the faint glow of his porch light illuminated the contours of his weary face. The modest two-story home stood like a sanctuary in the darkness, but tonight it offered little comfort. He sat in the silence of his car for a moment, gripping the steering wheel tightly before exhaling slowly and stepping out. Inside, the familiar warmth of his home greeted him. Photos of his family, his late wife, his teenage daughter Maya, lined the hallway. He paused for a moment at a photo of Maya's graduation, her smile beaming with pride. It reminded him of why he couldn't afford to turn away from what happened tonight. This wasn't just about him. It was about her, about every child who deserved to grow up in a world where authority didn't mean fear. Meanwhile, Officer Logan Carter sat in his patrol car, parked under the dim light of a flickering street lamp. His hands trembled slightly as they rested on the steering wheel, knuckles pale from the tension. He replayed Marcus's words in his head over and over. "I'm Marcus Hayes, head of internal affairs for the Marlo Police Department." It felt like a noose tightening around his neck. Logan wasn't new to policing. 8 years on the force, 3 commendations for bravery, and a reputation for being a by-the-book cop. But somewhere along the way, prejudice had crept into his perspective like an insidious shadow. He told himself it wasn't racism, just instinct, just experience. But Marcus's unflinching stare had shattered that lie. The radio crackled softly in the background, but Logan didn't hear it. Instead, he stared out into the empty streets, knowing that Marcus had the power to dismantle his career with a single report. But what scared him more wasn't losing his job. It was facing himself in the mirror and realizing he might deserve it. The next morning, Marcus stood in his office at the Internal Affairs Division, surrounded by walls covered in commendations, certificates, and neatly filed reports. Sunlight streamed in through the tall windows, casting sharp shadows across his desk. His assistant, Rachel Turner, a sharp-witted woman in her early 30s with a gift for reading people, knocked gently on his open door. "Sir, Officer Carter has requested a meeting with you," she said, her tone careful, her eyes scanning Marcus's face for any sign of hesitation. Marcus leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers as he considered her words. "Did he say why?" Rachel shook her head. "No, but he sounded nervous." Marcus nodded once, his gaze steady. "Send him in." Moments later, Logan walked into the office, his uniform neatly pressed, but his posture slightly hunched, a man carrying an invisible weight on his shoulders. He hesitated in the doorway before stepping forward. "Sir," Logan said, his voice tight. "Take a seat, Officer Carter," Marcus replied, his voice calm yet firm. Logan sat down, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. For a moment, the silence hung heavy between them, the air charged with unspoken words. Finally, Marcus broke it. "Why are you here, Logan?" The use of his first name caught Logan off guard. His eyes darted briefly to the floor before meeting Marcus's unflinching gaze. Last night, Logan began, his voice faltering slightly. Last night, I crossed a line. I let my biases control my actions, and for that, I'm sorry. Marcus studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he spoke, his words were deliberate. Do you know how many complaints cross my desk every year, Logan? How many people come in here beaten down and silenced because someone in a uniform let their power turn into poison? Logan swallowed hard, his throat tight. Too many, I'm sure. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his eyes sharp and unyielding. You didn't just pull over a black man last night, Logan. You pulled over a father, a leader, someone who's spent his entire career trying to build trust between our department and this community, and you nearly tore that down in 5 minutes. Logan flinched at the words, his shoulders slumping slightly. I know, sir. I know I can't undo what happened, but I'm willing to make it right, if you'll let me. Marcus let the words hang in the air before responding. Making it right isn't about words, Logan. It's about actions. Are you prepared for that? Logan nodded, his voice firm this time. Yes, sir. Whatever it takes. Marcus leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. Then we'll start here. You're going to write a full report about what happened last night. Every detail. No omissions. Then you're going to attend mandatory sensitivity and bias training. And after that, you're going to volunteer for community outreach programs, places where you'll have to face the people you've let down. Logan nodded, his throat tight as he managed to whisper, Understood. Marcus stood, extending a hand across the desk. After a brief hesitation, Logan stood as well and took it. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. As Logan left the office, Rachel stepped in once more, her brow slightly furrowed. Do you think he'll change? She asked softly. Marcus stared out the window at the city below, the hum of life continuing in quiet chaos. I don't know, he said honestly, but we have to give him the chance to try. The sun continued its slow arc across the sky as Marcus turned back to his desk, determination hardening his features. Today was just one step, but steps, no matter how small, were how mountains were moved. The soft hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Marcus Hayes walked into the conference room at the Internal Affairs Division. The walls were lined with framed mission statements and old photographs of police officers shaking hands with community members, images meant to symbolize trust. But Marcus knew better than most how thin that trust had become. At the head of the table sat Chief Samuel Bennett, a tall man in his late 50s, with a square jaw, silver hair, and a demeanor that could quiet a room with just one look. His dark navy suit was impeccable, but there was an edge to his expression today, a hint of unease as Marcus approached. Morning, Marcus, Chief Bennett said, his gravelly voice cutting through the stillness. Morning, Chief, Marcus replied, taking a seat across from him. Beside Chief Bennett sat Captain Elise Grant, a no-nonsense officer with sharp hazel eyes and an air of quiet authority. Her arms were crossed, and she leaned slightly forward, waiting for Marcus to speak. Marcus laid a slim manila folder on the table and slid it toward the chief. This is Officer Logan Carter's formal report from the stop 2 nights ago, Marcus said, his voice steady. Along with my personal assessment. Bennett opened the folder, his brow furrowing as he read the first few lines. The silence was thick, broken only by the faint ticking of a wall clock. Elise's eyes flickered between the two men, her face unreadable. Marcus spoke again, his voice softer but resolute. This isn't just about Logan, Chief. It's about a culture. A pattern. One officer didn't create this problem, but one officer's actions can shine a light on it. Chief Bennett closed the folder and pinched the bridge of his nose. I don't have to tell you, Marcus, how complicated this is. You know as well as I do what happens when these kinds of stories hit the public. Marcus leaned forward, his voice low but charged with emotion. What happens, Samuel, is that another community loses faith in the people who are supposed to protect them. Another child learns to fear the badge instead of trust it. And good officers, the ones out there doing it right, get dragged down with the rest. Captain Grant finally spoke, her voice sharp but thoughtful. So what do you propose, Marcus? Marcus took a steadying breath before answering. Accountability, for starters. Logan Carter needs to face consequences, not as a scapegoat, but as an example. We can't sweep this under the rug, not this time. Elise nodded slowly, her eyes locked onto Marcus's. And after Carter? We start with training, Marcus said firmly. Real training, not a 2-hour slideshow about diversity. I'm talking immersive, ongoing programs about bias, conflict resolution, and community engagement. And we need oversight, external oversight. Transparency isn't optional anymore. Chief Bennett's gaze softened slightly as he looked at Marcus. You know this isn't going to make you popular, Marcus. Some of the brass are going to push back hard. Marcus's lips pressed into a thin line. I didn't take this job to be popular, Chief. I took it because I believed we could be better. And I still do. The weight of his words lingered in the air, and for a moment, no one spoke. Outside the conference room window, the city of Marlo moved on. A blur of people living their lives, unaware of the decisions being made in this sterile room. Finally, Chief Bennett exhaled deeply and nodded. All right, Marcus, write up your recommendations. We'll bring this to the department heads tomorrow. Marcus stood, his posture straight and unyielding. Thank you, Chief. As he turned to leave, Elise's voice stopped him. Marcus, she said softly, whatever happens, don't lose that fire. We need it. Later that evening, Marcus found himself at a local diner, a quiet spot he'd frequented for years. The hum of conversations, the clinking of dishes, and the scent of fresh coffee created a sense of normalcy that he desperately needed. He sat at a corner booth, staring out the window at the dimming sky. The weight of the day pressed heavily on him, and for a moment he allowed himself to feel it all. The frustration, the exhaustion, the hope. A familiar voice broke through his thoughts. You look like a man carrying the world on his shoulders. Marcus looked up to see Rosa Alvarez, the diner's owner and an old family friend. Her warm smile was framed by deep lines, and her sharp brown eyes still carried the fire of her younger days. Something like that, Rosa, Marcus said with a tired smile. She set a steaming mug of coffee in front of him and sat across the table, wiping her hands on her apron. You know, Marcus, my father used to say something when he was still running this place, Rosa said softly. He'd say, when you're standing in the fire, you either let it burn you or you let it forge you into something stronger. Marcus nodded slowly, wrapping his hands around the mug. Wise man. Rosa leaned forward slightly, her expression gentle but serious. You're a good man, Marcus, but being good isn't enough, is it? You've got to fight for it, every single day. For a moment, Marcus didn't respond. He simply stared down into the coffee, watching the steam rise in slow, curling wisps. I'm trying, Rosa, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Rosa reached out and placed her hand over his. Then that's enough. As Marcus left the diner, the night sky stretched above him, endless and unyielding. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement as he walked to his car. For a brief moment, he paused, looking up at the stars, tiny pinpricks of light in an otherwise dark canvas. And in that stillness, Marcus found something small but powerful. Resolve. Tomorrow would bring another battle, another meeting, another fight against a system that felt impossibly heavy, but Marcus Hayes was ready. The large conference hall of the Marlo Police Department buzzed with murmurs as senior officers, detectives, and community representatives filled the rows of stiff chairs. The polished mahogany podium at the front gleamed under the bright overhead lights, while the city's crest hung proudly on the wall behind it. Today wasn't just another meeting. It was a reckoning. Marcus Hayes stood near the podium, reviewing his notes. His suit was sharp, his shoulders squared, and his expression unyielding. Beside him, Chief Samuel Bennett adjusted his tie, his face a mask of stern professionalism. In the audience, Captain Elise Grant sat in the front row, arms crossed, her eyes sharp and focused. As the last few people shuffled into their seats, Marcus stepped up to the podium. The room quieted instantly. His gaze swept across the sea of faces, some familiar, some not, but all expectant. Good afternoon, Marcus began, his voice firm but calm. We're here today because something happened, something that cannot be ignored or swept aside. 2 nights ago, an officer of this department violated the trust placed in him by this city, by this community, and by this badge. A ripple of unease passed through the crowd, shoulders shifting uncomfortably, throats clearing in the silence. This isn't about one bad apple, Marcus continued, his voice rising slightly. This is about a pattern, a culture that allows these moments to happen, and then expects silence to smooth things over. He paused, letting his words settle. In the corner of the room, Officer Logan Carter sat, his uniform crisp but his face pale. He kept his gaze downward, his jaw tight. We owe it to our community, to ourselves, and to the badge we wear to confront this head-on. This department cannot and will not become a place where accountability is optional. A single clap broke the silence. Elise Grant's hands came together slowly, followed by a few others. Marcus continued. I'm proposing immediate reforms. First, Officer Carter will face disciplinary action in alignment with our department's code of conduct. Second, we'll implement mandatory bias and de-escalation training, not once, not as a checkbox, but regularly. Third, we're establishing an independent oversight committee that will include members of the community to ensure transparency in every investigation. More murmurs erupted, some nodding in agreement, others exchanging skeptical glances. Marcus leaned forward, his voice low but intense. If we're afraid of transparency, then we have something to hide. And if we have something to hide, then we are failing, not just as officers, but as people. From the back of the room, a gruff voice spoke up. It was Lieutenant Derek Walsh, a burly officer with 30 years on the force and a reputation for being unapologetically blunt. And what happens when morale drops, Marcus? When officers feel like they're walking on eggshells every time they make a stop? Policing isn't easy. You know that better than anyone. Marcus nodded, his expression softening slightly. You're right, Derek. Policing isn't easy. Every stop, every call, it carries weight. But accountability isn't about punishing every mistake. It's about preventing abuse of power. And when mistakes happen, it's about learning, not hiding. The room was silent again, and for a moment, Marcus could feel the weight of every eye on him. Chief Bennett cleared his throat and stepped up to the podium. What Marcus is proposing isn't just a set of rules, it's a mindset shift, the chief said, his gravelly voice filling the space. We can't keep doing the same thing and expecting trust to magically return. Change is uncomfortable, but it's necessary, and it starts today. The faint sound of applause started again, this time growing louder. Officers exchanged glances, some nodding in reluctant agreement, others staring ahead with stony expressions. But amidst the mix of acceptance and resistance, something shifted in the room. A crack in the wall of silence that had held firm for too long. After the meeting, Marcus found himself in his office, staring out the window at the city below. The sun had dipped low, painting the sky in hues of orange and deep blue. The weight of the day settled on his shoulders like a heavy coat. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Come in, Marcus said. The door opened and Officer Logan Carter stepped in. His face was tight with emotion, his posture slightly hunched, not out of weakness but humility. Sir, I wanted to thank you, Logan said quietly. Not for letting me off the hook, but for giving me a chance to be better. Marcus turned, his gaze steady. A chance, Logan. That's all it is. What you do with it, that's on you. Logan nodded, swallowing hard. I won't waste it. As Logan turned to leave, Marcus spoke again. One more thing, Logan. Logan paused, his hand on the doorknob. You're going to be one of the first officers in the new community outreach program, Marcus said. I want you out there, meeting people, hearing their stories. It's not just about fixing yourself, it's about fixing the connection between us and them. Logan nodded once, determination flickering in his eyes before he left the room. That night, Marcus walked through a quiet park near his home. The faint sound of crickets echoed through the trees, and the distant glow of city lights framed the horizon. He spotted a young father sitting on a bench with his daughter, the little girl's laughter carrying in the night air. Marcus closed his eyes briefly, the memory of his own daughter, Maya, flooding his thoughts. He remembered her as a child, her tiny hand gripping his finger, her wide eyes filled with trust every time he came home in uniform. For her, for every child like her, for every parent who deserved to know their child would be safe in their own city. The road ahead was long, and the obstacles were daunting, but tonight Marcus allowed himself a small moment of peace, a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, things could change. Tomorrow would bring more meetings, more resistance, more battles. But tonight, under the quiet expanse of the night sky, Marcus Hayes walked forward, steady and unyielding. He would not look away. The pale morning light crept through the blinds of Marcus Hayes's office, casting long shadows across stacks of reports, memos, and folders scattered on his desk. The scent of coffee lingered in the air, its warmth battling the cold edge of exhaustion etched into Marcus's face. He sat with his elbows on the desk, fingers steepled, eyes fixed on a report in front of him. It wasn't just about Logan Carter anymore. It was about everything the stop represented. Bias, power imbalance, institutional inertia. The weight of it pressed down on his chest like a stone. The knock on his door came sharp and deliberate. "Come in," Marcus said, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Rachel Turner, his sharp-witted assistant, stepped in holding a tablet. Her auburn hair was pulled into a neat bun, and her expression was tight with concern. "Marcus," she began, hesitating for just a moment. "The media picked up the story. There's already chatter online. People are calling for Officer Carter's resignation, and there's pushback from the union." Marcus sighed deeply. "How bad is it?" Rachel turned the tablet toward him. News headlines blared. "Marlo PD under scrutiny after incident sparks internal investigation." "Accountability or overreach? Department faces backlash over proposed reforms." "Head of Internal Affairs takes bold stand, but will it make a difference?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, his gaze heavy with fatigue. "It's always the same dance, isn't it? Public outrage, departmental resistance, political maneuvering." Rachel nodded. "But this time people are watching you, Marcus. They're watching us." The weight of her words hung in the air, undeniable. Marcus nodded and pushed away from his desk, grabbing his coat. "Come on, Rachel, it's time to face this head-on." The community hall was packed. Rows of folding chairs were filled with residents of Marlo, parents, teachers, students, shop owners, and retirees. The hum of anxious conversations filled the air as the crowd waited for answers. At the front of the room, a modest wooden podium and a small microphone stood as the focal point. Marcus walked in, flanked by Chief Samuel Bennett and Captain Elise Grant. He felt every set of eyes on him, the weight of expectation, the flicker of doubt, the cautious hope. He stepped up to the podium, adjusted the microphone, and scanned the crowd. "Good evening," Marcus began, his voice steady but warm. "Thank you all for being here tonight. I know there's anger, fear, and frustration in this room, and every single one of those feelings is valid." A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience. What happened the other night wasn't just an isolated event. It was a symptom of a much larger issue, a fracture in the trust between this department and this community. And if we don't address it, that fracture will become a break. In the back of the room, a woman stood. Mrs. Tanya Evans, a schoolteacher and mother of two, her voice trembling but firm as she spoke. "Mr. Hayes, how can we trust the system to change when so many people have been hurt by it for so long? How do we know this isn't just another empty promise?" The question cut through the room like a knife, and Marcus felt its sharp edge deep in his chest. He took a deep breath before answering. "Mrs. Evans, I won't stand here and pretend that words are enough. They're not, and I won't ask for your trust. I'll ask for your patience. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it will happen if we keep pushing forward together." A slow nod from Mrs. Evans. Others in the room murmured their agreement. Another voice spoke up. David Torres, a young man in his early 20s with sharp eyes and a determined posture. "What about Officer Carter? Is he still walking around with a badge and a gun?" Chief Bennett stepped forward to answer. "Officer Carter has been temporarily relieved of active duty pending further investigation. He's cooperating with our internal review and has begun mandatory training." David crossed his arms, his voice tight. "And what happens if he messes up again? If someone else gets hurt?" Marcus leaned forward slightly, his voice firm but compassionate. "David, there are no guarantees, but I can promise you this. We're not letting this slide. We're not turning our backs. And we're not going to stop until every officer in this department understands what it means to wear this badge with honor." The room fell silent for a moment. Then applause began, hesitant at first, then growing louder as others joined in. After the meeting, Marcus lingered in the empty hall, staring at the rows of folding chairs and the faint glow of the exit sign. The voices of the people still echoed in his mind, their hope, their doubt, their pain. Elise walked up beside him, hands in her coat pockets. "You handled that well, Marcus." "Did I?" he asked softly, his voice laced with exhaustion. Because right now, it feels like we're standing at the edge of a cliff, and one wrong step will send us all over. Elise gave a small, wry smile. Change isn't easy, Marcus. You're trying to turn a ship that's been sailing in the wrong direction for decades. It's going to creak and groan, but at least it's starting to turn. Marcus nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the empty chairs. I just hope it's enough. That night, Marcus sat at his kitchen table with a glass of water in front of him. His daughter Maya, now 17, entered the room quietly. She had her mother's eyes and her father's quiet strength. Dad? She said softly. Marcus looked up, his expression softening instantly. Hey, sweetheart, you're still up? I saw the live stream of the meeting, she said, sitting across from him. You did good. Marcus's throat tightened slightly, and he reached across the table to take her hand. I'm trying, Maya. I really am. She squeezed his hand gently. You always told me that doing the right thing is rarely the easiest thing, but it's still the right thing. Marcus smiled faintly, pride and love swelling in his chest. Your mom would be so proud of you. They sat in silence for a while, the quiet hum of the refrigerator filling the space. Outside the window, the faint glow of the city lights flickered in the distance. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, filling the silence of Marcus Hayes' office. The blinds were drawn halfway, casting sharp lines of light across the scattered papers and files on his desk. His tie was loosened, his sleeves rolled up, and his face carried the weariness of a man shouldering the weight of an entire institution's failures. It had been 3 weeks since the public meeting. 3 weeks of relentless work, meetings with community leaders, tense conversations with union representatives, and late-night strategy sessions with Chief Samuel Bennett and Captain Elise Grant. Progress was slow, resistance was loud, but the ship was turning, 1 degree at a time. A knock at the door pulled Marcus from his thoughts. Come in, he said, his voice gruff from fatigue. The door creaked open, and Officer Logan Carter stepped inside. His uniform was neat, his posture straighter than before, but his eyes carried a weight that hadn't been there weeks ago. Sir, Logan said, his voice measured. You asked to see me? Marcus gestured to the chair across his desk. Sit down, Officer Carter. Logan complied, his hands resting on his knees, the silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Marcus folded his hands on the desk and studied Logan for a long moment before speaking. You've been attending your training sessions, community outreach, meetings with oversight teams. How's it been going? Logan's throat bobbed as he swallowed. It's been eye-opening, sir. I've heard stories from people, real stories, things I never thought about when I put on this badge every day. It's changed how I see the people I'm supposed to protect. Marcus nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly. Good, but tell me, Logan, do you feel different? Or are you just saying the right things? The question hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Logan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his brows furrowed. I feel different, sir, Logan said, his voice softer now. But I also feel ashamed. Every time I walk into those community centers, I see their faces, the fear, the doubt, and I know I caused some of that. Marcus leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. Shame can be useful, Logan. It keeps us accountable. But it's not enough on its own. If you want to make this right, it has to be more than regret. It has to be action, consistency, and humility. Logan nodded, his voice steady this time. I understand, sir. I won't let this end with me. I'll make sure it means something. For the first time in weeks, Marcus allowed himself a small, tired smile. Good. Now go and keep showing up, every single day. Logan stood, gave a respectful nod, and left the office, the door clicking shut behind him. Later that afternoon, Marcus sat in a sterile conference room alongside Chief Samuel Bennett and Captain Elise Grant. Across from them sat Union Representative Kevin Price, a wiry man in his late 40s with sharp eyes and a lawyer's smooth smile. Marcus, Kevin began, folding his hands in front of him. The union is growing increasingly concerned with the direction these reforms are taking. Officers feel targeted, scrutinized, like every move they make is being judged under a microscope. Marcus held his gaze, his voice calm but firm. Kevin, we're not targeting officers, we're targeting bad behavior. There's a difference. Kevin smirked faintly. And yet morale is plummeting. We're seeing an uptick in officers taking early retirement, others transferring to different precincts. You're creating a culture of fear. Fear? Marcus's voice sharpened, his brows knitting together. Fear isn't coming from these reforms, Kevin. Fear comes from what happens when an officer pulls over someone like me and assumes the worst because of the color of my skin. Fear comes from a child watching their father handcuffed on the side of the road for no reason. Fear isn't about oversight. It's about abuse of power. The room fell silent. Even Chief Bennett, usually the diplomatic voice in these meetings, stayed quiet. Elise Grant's sharp hazel eyes locked onto Kevin, daring him to respond. Kevin sighed, rubbing his temples. Look, Marcus, I'm not saying we shouldn't address these issues, but there has to be balance. Officers need to feel like they have support from leadership, or this department is going to fall apart. Marcus's expression softened slightly, and he nodded. You're right, Kevin. Officers need support, but they also need accountability. Those two things aren't mutually exclusive. If we can't build trust within our own ranks, how can we expect the community to trust us? Kevin looked down at the table, his jaw tight. I'll take this back to the union board, he said finally. But don't expect this to be easy. I never expected it to be easy, Marcus replied, his voice steady. That evening, Marcus found himself in his late wife's garden, surrounded by the soft scent of jasmine and roses. The sun was setting, casting warm hues across the sky, and the distant hum of traffic filtered through the suburban calm. Maya joined him, carrying 2 mugs of tea. She handed one to him before settling onto the wooden bench beside him. How was your day, Dad? She asked softly. Marcus took a sip of his tea, the warmth spreading through him. Complicated. But hopeful, I think. Maya looked up at the sky, her dark curls catching the soft light. Do you ever feel like you're trying to fix something too broken to heal? Marcus paused, staring at the steam rising from his mug. All the time, sweetheart, but if we stop trying, then it really is broken beyond repair. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the world hanging softly between them. Then Maya spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. You're making a difference, Dad, even if it feels small. Even if it feels like it's not enough. Marcus's throat tightened as he reached out and gently squeezed her hand. Thank you, Maya. I needed to hear that. The sky dimmed further, stars beginning to pepper the horizon. And in that fleeting moment of quiet connection, Marcus found something he'd been chasing for weeks, a small flicker of peace. The air in Marcus Hayes's office felt thick, almost suffocating. The sunlight filtering through the blinds did little to ease the tension clinging to every corner of the room. Papers were scattered across his desk, reports from the Oversight Committee, letters from community leaders, and scathing op-eds from local newspapers questioning whether real change was even possible. Marcus rubbed his temples, exhaustion etched into every line on his face. 3 months had passed since the reforms began, and while there were small victories, a few officers embracing training, some community members expressing cautious optimism, there was also resistance. Loud, relentless resistance. A sharp knock on the door pulled him from his spiraling thoughts. Come in, he said hoarsely. Captain Elise Grant walked in, a stack of files tucked under her arm. Her face was set in a hard line, her eyes sharp and unyielding. We've got a problem, Marcus, she said, dropping the files onto his desk. There was an incident last night, Officer Derek Walsh. Marcus's stomach tightened. What happened? Elise hesitated, her voice softening slightly. He stopped a teenager, Malik Harris. Routine stop. We've got a problem, Marcus, she said, dropping the files onto his desk. There was an incident last night, Officer Derek Walsh. Marcus's stomach tightened. What happened? Elise hesitated, her voice softening slightly. He stopped a teenager, Malik Harris. Routine stop. But it escalated. Malik ended up in the hospital, broken wrist, bruised ribs. Marcus closed his eyes briefly, the weight of the words sinking deep. Is there body cam footage? Elise nodded, her voice grim. Yes, and it's bad, Marcus. Without another word, Elise handed Marcus a tablet. With trembling hands, he pressed play. The screen flickered to life, showing Officer Derek Walsh, his posture rigid, towering over a frightened 17-year-old boy. Malik's voice trembled as he answered Derek's sharp questions. The tension built, escalating to shouting, then to violence. Derek grabbed Malik by the arm, forcing him onto the hood of his car. The boy's muffled cries of pain echoed through the tinny audio. The footage ended, and the silence in the room was deafening. Marcus set the tablet down carefully, his hand trembling slightly. Where's Derek now? He's been suspended pending investigation, but the union is already raising hell, Elise said, her voice sharp with anger. They're saying Malik was resisting arrest. They're calling him a threat. Marcus stood, his chair scraping against the floor. His chest rose and fell with deep, steady breaths, his gaze fixed on a spot on the wall. This can't keep happening, he said quietly, his voice low but sharp as a knife. We've put protocols in place, training, oversight, and still? Elise softened, stepping closer. Marcus, this isn't on you. You're fighting a system that's been broken for decades. One man can't fix it overnight. Marcus's voice cracked slightly as he spoke. But one man can still make a choice. Derek made his, and now Malik has to live with the consequences. The press conference was called within hours. Cameras flashed, microphones clustered together, and the dull roar of anxious voices filled the City Hall auditorium. Marcus stepped up to the podium, flanked by Chief Samuel Bennett and Captain Elise Grant. His suit was immaculate, but his shoulders were heavy with invisible weight. Good evening, Marcus began, gripping the edges of the podium tightly. Last night, there was an incident involving Officer Derek Walsh and a young man named Malik Harris. Malik was injured during what should have been a routine traffic stop. He paused, his voice steady despite the emotion building behind his words. This department has rules. It has protocols. And when those rules are ignored, when those protocols are broken, there must be consequences. Officer Derek Walsh has been suspended, and there will be a full, independent investigation. No excuses, no cover-ups. The crowd murmured, camera flashes lighting up Marcus's face. He leaned forward slightly, his voice firm but deeply empathetic. To the Harris family, and to every family who's been hurt by the failures of this department, I'm sorry. I know those words aren't enough, but I promise you this. We will not stop. We will not look away, and we will not allow this pattern to continue. In the front row, Malik's mother, Shauna Harris, sat clutching a photograph of her son. Her face was streaked with tears, her shoulders trembling slightly. Their eyes met, Marcus and Shauna, and in that fleeting moment, an unspoken promise passed between them. That evening, Marcus visited Malik Harris in the hospital. The sterile white walls and faint hum of monitors filled the room with an uneasy stillness. Malik lay in bed, his arm wrapped in a cast, his face bruised but his eyes sharp with quiet resilience. Beside him sat Shauna Harris, her hand protectively around her son's. She looked up as Marcus entered, her expression unreadable. "Mrs. Harris, Malik," Marcus said softly, standing just inside the doorway. Shauna nodded, her voice tight with exhaustion. "You came." "I had to," Marcus said simply. He stepped closer, pulling a chair up to the bedside. Malik's eyes met Marcus's, and for a moment neither spoke. "Malik," Marcus began carefully, "I want you to know that what happened to you was wrong. Deeply, unforgivably wrong. And I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." Malik's lips pressed into a thin line, and his voice trembled slightly when he spoke. "You can't promise that." Marcus's throat tightened, but he nodded. "You're right. I can't promise that. But I can promise you that I won't stop trying." Shauna squeezed her son's hand as tears welled in her eyes. "That's all we ask, Mr. Hayes. Just don't stop trying." Marcus sat with them for a while longer, listening to Malik talk about his plans, his dreams, and his fear of ever being pulled over again. When he finally stood to leave, he carried their voices with him. The weight of their pain, but also the flicker of their hope. As Marcus walked out of the hospital into the cool night air, he looked up at the vast, star-studded sky. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a message from Captain Elise Grant. "Union meeting scheduled for tomorrow. They're pushing back hard. We'll need every ounce of resolve." Marcus stared at the message for a long moment before slipping the phone back into his pocket. The night stretched out before him, vast and unyielding. But Marcus Hayes kept walking, his steps steady, his heart heavy but resolute. There was still so much work to do. The union meeting was held in a large, echoing hall in the basement of the Marlo police headquarters. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as rows of officers, both in and out of uniform, filled the chairs. Conversations swirled through the air, frustration, anger, exhaustion. And the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. At the front of the room stood Kevin Price, the union representative, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd. Beside him sat Marcus Hayes, his posture straight and resolute, and Chief Samuel Bennett, his expression unreadable. Kevin tapped the microphone twice, clearing his throat. "All right, settle down, everyone." The murmur of voices slowly faded into silence. "We've gathered here today to address the reforms being implemented under Internal Affairs and Marcus Hayes's leadership," Kevin said, his voice steady but edged with irritation. "There's no denying these changes are shaking things up. But there's also no denying that morale is plummeting. Officers are second-guessing every decision they make, and trust, within these walls, is wearing thin." A few scattered nods rippled through the crowd, followed by muffled agreement. Kevin turned slightly toward Marcus, his voice sharp. "Marcus, we're not saying reforms aren't needed, but you're moving too fast, and you're alienating your own people in the process." Marcus leaned forward, his voice calm yet firm as it carried through the hall. "Kevin, I'm not here to make friends. I'm here to fix something that's broken. And the truth is, some of these changes are long overdue." An officer in the crowd stood abruptly. Sergeant Pete Dwyer, a seasoned cop with 20 years on the force, his voice shaking with frustration. "You're asking us to go out there and second-guess every move we make, every stop, every call. We're afraid that one wrong step is going to end our careers." Marcus's eyes met Pete's, his voice soft but clear. "Sergeant Dwyer, I understand your fear. But the people out there, they're afraid too. They're afraid their sons, their daughters, their fathers won't come home after a routine stop. That fear isn't just theirs to carry, it's ours too." The room went silent again, the weight of Marcus's words hanging heavy in the air. Kevin cut in, his voice tight. "And what about Officer Walsh? He's being hung out to dry while this department uses him as a scapegoat." Marcus's jaw tightened, his voice carrying a sharp edge now. "Officer Walsh made a choice that left a teenager bruised and in a hospital bed. We cannot, and we will not, turn a blind eye to that. Accountability isn't punishment, it's responsibility. And if we can't hold ourselves accountable, then we have no right to expect trust from anyone else." Chief Bennett finally spoke, his gravelly voice cutting through the tension. "This isn't about punishing officers for doing their jobs. It's about ensuring that the badge we wear actually means something. If that's too much to ask, then maybe you're wearing the wrong badge." The room fell into a heavy silence. Officers exchanged glances, some nodding reluctantly, others staring ahead with tight jaws. Marcus could feel the tension, the resistance, but he also saw something else, a flicker of understanding. A seed planted. After the meeting, Marcus walked out into the crisp evening air. The city skyline loomed in the distance, a cluster of glowing lights against the darkening sky. Chief Bennett joined him, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his overcoat. "They won't all follow you, Marcus," Bennett said softly. "Some of them will fight you until their last day on the force." Marcus nodded, his voice weary. "I know, Sam, but if even a few of them start to see the truth, if even one life is saved because of these changes, it'll be worth it." Bennett clapped a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Don't let this break you, Marcus. The system eats good men alive if they let it." Marcus offered a faint smile. "It's not me I'm worried about, Sam. It's the ones who don't have a voice, the ones who get left behind." They stood together in silence, the cold air biting at their skin, the city stretching out before them. The following day, Marcus attended a community meeting at St. James Community Center. The room was packed. Families, students, activists, and elderly residents, their faces etched with both exhaustion and fragile hope. At the front of the room stood Tanya Evans, the schoolteacher who had spoken out at the earlier public forum. Her voice was steady as she addressed the crowd. "We've seen promises before. We've heard speeches. But change, real change, has always felt just out of reach. And maybe it still is," Tanya said, her voice cracking slightly. "But I'll tell you this. Marcus Hayes stood in that hall with us. He stood in the hospital with Malik Harris. And he's standing here now. That means something." Marcus stood from the back of the room and slowly approached the podium. The crowd turned to face him, their eyes expectant. "Thank you, Tanya," Marcus said, his voice low but clear. "I'm not here to ask for your trust, because trust has to be earned. But I am here to promise you that I won't stop fighting. Not until this city is safer for every single one of you. Not until accountability isn't just a word we throw around at press conferences, but something you see in action every single day." From the back of the room, Shauna Harris spoke softly. "We're holding you to that, Mr. Hayes." Marcus's eyes met hers, and he nodded. "I wouldn't expect anything less." That night, Marcus sat at his desk in his quiet office, staring out the window at the city lights. The faint hum of traffic drifted up from the streets below. On his desk sat a stack of letters, some supportive, others filled with anger and distrust. Rachel Turner appeared in the doorway, her voice soft. "It's late, Marcus. You should go home." Marcus looked up, a faint, tired smile on his face. "Not yet, Rachel. Not tonight." As Rachel left, Marcus leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the skyline. Somewhere out there, people were holding on to fragile hope. Somewhere out there, someone was afraid. He couldn't stop. Not now. The road ahead was long, and the obstacles were growing sharper, but Marcus Hayes wasn't done fighting. Not even close. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Marlo Police Department headquarters as Marcus Hayes stood in his office, staring at the whiteboard filled with names, arrows, and scribbled notes. The board told a story of broken trust, shattered lives, and a system straining under the weight of its own contradictions. His phone buzzed on the desk. A text from Captain Elise Grant. "Union leadership meeting moved up to tonight. They're planning to push for your removal." Marcus sighed deeply, pinching the bridge of his nose. The weight of every conversation, every confrontation, every moment of doubt pressed down on him. He knew this was coming. Change always fought back. His assistant, Rachel Turner, knocked softly on the door before stepping in. Her expression was etched with concern. "You saw the text?" Marcus nodded. "I did." They're not just questioning the reforms anymore, Marcus. They're questioning you, your integrity, your leadership. They're saying you're driving a wedge between the department and the community." Marcus looked up at her, his eyes sharp but calm. "Rachel, the wedge was already there. I'm just refusing to pretend it's not." Rachel hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "What are you going to do?" Marcus turned to face the window, watching the sun dip lower behind the city skyline. "I'm going to show up, Rachel, and I'm going to tell them the truth." The union meeting was held in the largest precinct auditorium, a cavernous room with harsh fluorescent lights and rows of folding chairs filled with officers, union leaders, and department staff. The murmur of voices filled the air as officers exchanged glances, their faces etched with skepticism, frustration, and in some, quiet support. At the front of the room, Kevin Price stood beside a long table lined with senior union members. He cleared his throat and addressed the crowd. "Tonight, we're here because this department is at a crossroads. Under Marcus Hayes' leadership, we've seen sweeping reforms, some necessary, others questionable. But the question before us tonight isn't about policies. It's about leadership, and whether Marcus Hayes is still the right man to lead internal affairs." A few scattered murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Marcus stepped forward, his stride steady, his shoulders squared. He approached the podium, gripping its edges tightly as he scanned the crowd. Faces stared back at him, some cold, some tired, some hopeful. "When I took this job," Marcus began, his voice calm yet firm, "I knew it wouldn't make me popular. I knew it wouldn't make me many friends. But I also knew something else. Silence is complicity. And I refuse to be complicit in a system that allows abuse to go unchecked." The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the overhead lights. "Some of you see me as an enemy, as someone who doesn't understand the weight of the badge you wear every day. But I do. I've worn it. I've stood where you stand. I know what it feels like to make split-second decisions with lives on the line." He paused, his voice softening slightly. "But I also know that trust isn't just given, it's earned. And every time we fail to hold ourselves accountable, every time we choose silence over action, we lose a little more of that trust from our community, from our families, and from ourselves." From the middle row, Sergeant Pete Dwyer stood up again, his voice firm but less hostile this time. "But what about us, Marcus? Who's looking out for us while we're out there risking our lives? These reforms make it feel like we're walking into a war zone without backup." Marcus nodded, his voice steady. "Pete, accountability and support aren't opposites. They're two sides of the same coin. I want every officer here to feel supported, respected, and valued. But I also want every citizen in this city to feel safe when they see one of us coming toward them." From the back of the room, a younger officer raised his hand. Officer Jake Reynolds, barely 2 years on the force. Do you really think these reforms will change anything, sir? Or is this just another cycle, another speech, another meeting, and then nothing? Marcus met Jake's gaze, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. Jake, I can't promise you that change will happen overnight, or that it'll be easy, but I can promise you this. If we stop trying, nothing will change, and if nothing changes, more people will get hurt on both sides. The room fell into an uneasy silence. Kevin Price leaned toward his microphone. So what happens now, Marcus? What happens if this department decides it doesn't want your reforms anymore? Marcus took a deep breath, his shoulders squared. Then you'll have my resignation on your desk tomorrow morning. But know this, whether I'm sitting in this chair or not, the truth doesn't change. Accountability isn't optional, and trust isn't a given, it's earned every single day. For a long, breathless moment, the room was still. Officers glanced at each other, whispers threading through the air like static electricity. Then from the corner of the room, Captain Elise Grant stood up and began clapping slowly. One by one, other officers joined in. Some clapped reluctantly, others with conviction. But the applause grew, spreading across the room like a slow-moving wave. Kevin Price leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Marcus turned from the podium and walked toward the exit. As he passed Elise, she gave him a small nod of respect. Chief Samuel Bennett stood near the door, his eyes steady with something close to pride. You held your ground, Marcus, Bennett said quietly. Whatever happens next, you did everything you could. Marcus nodded, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. Let's hope it was enough. That night, Marcus drove through the quiet streets of Marlo. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows over the pavement. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat, a text from Maya. Proud of you, Dad. No matter what happens. For a long, breathless moment, the room was still. Officers glanced at each other, whispers threading through the air like static electricity. Then from the corner of the room, Captain Elise Grant stood up and began clapping slowly. One by one, other officers joined in. Some clapped reluctantly, others with conviction. But the applause grew, spreading across the room like a slow-moving wave. Kevin Price leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Marcus turned from the podium and walked toward the exit. As he passed Elise, she gave him a small nod of respect. Chief Samuel Bennett stood near the door, his eyes steady with something close to pride. You held your ground, Marcus, Bennett said quietly. Whatever happens next, you did everything you could. Marcus nodded, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. Let's hope it was enough. That night, Marcus drove through the quiet streets of Marlo. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows over the pavement. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat, a text from Maya. Proud of you, Dad. No matter what happens. Marcus's throat tightened as he read the words. He pulled over, resting his forehead against the steering wheel. For a long moment, he just breathed. The fight wasn't over. It might never be over. But tonight, Marcus Hayes had spoken his truth. And sometimes, that was enough to keep moving forward. The city of Marlo awoke under a gray sky, rain tapping gently against the windows of Marcus Hayes' office. The faint glow of streetlights still lingered in the foggy morning, blurring the line between night and day. Marcus sat at his desk, staring at the stack of reports, letters, and statements scattered before him. Today was the day. A final meeting with Chief Samuel Bennett, Captain Elise Grant, and the Oversight Committee would determine the future of the reforms, and possibly Marcus's future with internal affairs. His phone buzzed. A message from Maya. No matter what happens today, Dad, I'm proud of you. I love you. Marcus closed his eyes, exhaling slowly as her words anchored him. He tucked the phone into his pocket and rose from his chair, grabbing his coat. The conference room was packed. Members of the Oversight Committee, representatives from the Marlo Police Union, and key community leaders sat around the large table. The air was thick with anticipation, a tense silence filling the room as Marcus entered. At the head of the table sat Chief Samuel Bennett, his face stern but not unkind. To his left, Elise Grant sat with her hands folded neatly in front of her. On the opposite side sat Kevin Price, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Marcus took his seat, placing a slim manila folder in front of him. The silence stretched, heavy and unyielding, until Chief Bennett spoke. Marcus, you've had months to implement your reforms. We've seen progress, but we've also seen backlash, within our ranks, within the community, and in the media. Today, we need to make a decision about whether we continue down this path or change course. Marcus nodded, his voice calm but resolute. I understand, Chief. Kevin Price leaned forward, his sharp voice slicing through the tension. Marcus, morale is still low. Officers feel like they're walking a tightrope. Some have already left the force, and the community? They're skeptical at best. Can you honestly tell me these reforms are working? Marcus met Kevin's gaze head-on. Change isn't easy, Kevin, and it's never fast. We're trying to heal wounds that have been festering for decades. But I can tell you this, we're seeing officers starting to approach their jobs differently. We're seeing community members coming forward with trust they didn't have before. It's slow, but it's happening. A member of the Oversight Committee, Dr. Anita Patel, a calm yet firm woman in her early 50s, adjusted her glasses. Marcus, you've put everything you have into this initiative. But if we continue, it means doubling down on funding, on training, and on accountability measures. Are you prepared to carry that weight? Because if you can't, this will collapse under its own pressure. Marcus straightened in his chair, his voice steady but filled with emotion. Dr. Patel, I've spent months watching people, good people, try to do their jobs under impossible circumstances. I've spoken to families who've lost loved ones because of abuse of power. And I've spoken to officers who are scared to make a single mistake because they know the stakes are so high. He paused, his voice softening. But I've also seen hope. I've seen officers show up to community outreach programs and start to listen, really listen. I've seen parents tell me they're starting to feel safe walking their children home from school. This isn't about me. It's about whether we as a department are brave enough to keep walking this path, no matter how hard it gets. The room was silent. Even Kevin Price, usually quick with a retort, remained still. Chief Bennett cleared his throat. All those in favor of continuing with the reforms as they stand, with Marcus Hayes leading internal affairs, please raise your hand. Slowly, one hand went up, then another, and another. When the final hand was raised, the majority was clear. It's decided, Chief Bennett said, his voice firm. The reforms will continue. Marcus, the weight remains on your shoulders, but you've earned our trust. A faint wave of relief washed over Marcus, though it didn't erase the exhaustion etched into his face. He nodded once. Thank you, Chief. I won't let you, or this city, down. The evening sun painted the sky in hues of gold and lavender as Marcus stood outside St. James Community Center. Families were gathering for a neighborhood event, children laughing, parents chatting, music playing faintly in the background. Marcus spotted Officer Logan Carter near a table set up for community outreach. Logan was kneeling down, showing a young boy how to tie a knot with a piece of rope. His demeanor was calm, his smile genuine. It was a sight Marcus had once doubted he'd see.